I would just comment on the how close we were in 1990s. I think in terms of capital inflows and all that, yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of these things. But if you look at trade and also in terms of industrial structure and how this was happening, this was already very much integrated. I mean, even if you look at late 1990s, I mean, much of exports came from not locally or domestically owned companies anymore. They were not actually operating in terms of really on free market. They were part of a close-knit Scandinavian value chain. And this, I think, was partially. I think also this might explain why you got 1.5 wrong. Is that there was an assumption, and still is for quite a bit, around that this industrial sector, the export sector, is able to generate enough jobs, enough income to lead Estonia to more or less sustainable path. So I think if you then look at capital inflows, you say, well, these capital inflows are actually giving us the better industrial structure, or the better structure in the economy. And I think this just was not there, and this was actually not just questioned enough, I think. And as I said in the beginning, I mean, if you go around, you see a nice whatever factory, and it just looks nice factory. But if you have to actually look into that. And this is something that we didn't do for 15 years. So nobody really wanted to look into what company level capabilities were created and all that. So this is it's not a central bank problem in that sense, because it's a Ministry of Economics problem in that sense, and they didn't do their job in that sense. But I argue that even if it was closed economies in terms of capital inflows and outflows, it was very much integrated into the global capitalism already.
Thank you very much, and thank you all three of you. As Professor Kattel suggested, let's begin with the questions from the audience, and we'll take a couple at a time and give everybody in the panel a chance to answer. So any questions?
We in Estonia.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not in Bologna anymore. Yes.
But we do have 1 or 2 foreigners in here that we might be able to rely on. But yes, any questions from anybody regardless of nationality?
Yes.
Rias?
Thank you for a great presentation. I'd just like to know if people foresaw the crisis, what, perhaps not the timing, but that there was a problem, what was your experience around were people receptive to this thing? I mean, could you elaborate on that? Because
sure.
U.S. has its Dr. Doom, but Europe doesn't seem to have any of its Doctor's Doom, And, the other thing is, could you elaborate, either you or anyone on the panel, about the question of resilience? Because if something like Lehman Brothers does happen, why should other countries be completely exposed to the muck? Let it stay there. Usually people have a handkerchief or something.
Right. Well, first, regarding the question that you raised regarding receptivity, it's a global problem, but I think it's perhaps a little bit worse in this part of the world. Not because the people are worse. In fact, I would argue in many respects they're better. But because of luck and timing. Bad luck in terms of timing. Getting back to that question. Was there receptivity? Yes. Paul Rauceps, who was at that time at Vienna, Latvian American, educated at Harvard, provided a platform for me to begin writing articles on just this topic. So were there people who were at least willing to listen? A few, yes. But I would argue that this is a problem that we see in much of the world today, maybe perhaps not so much in China, but there is very little pluralism with regards to intellectual production. It's very ideological. In fact, this is what George Soros was addressing with his Institute for New Economic Thinking. He essentially gave up on the economics profession. He just said it was far too corrupted. I mean, are the people necessarily bad? Well, some are bad, some are good, as with any group of people. But a kind of groupthink does take hold among people, and it can be very difficult to dislodge them from that kind of groupthink. Now, in terms of this groupthink on economic policy, did it just arise organically? Well, no. In the United States, for instance, the National Science Foundation, which provides most of the funds for research in economics, has quite distinctly funded research in that discipline that has a particular orientation. If you would like to see a nice study of this, I would suggest looking at Howard Vochtel's article in Challenge magazine in 2000. Vochtel is now Professor Emeritus of Economics at American University, and he used to sit on the grant review board for the NSF, and he was appalled by what he saw in terms of the ideological bias. In terms of and people are not stupid by the time they get to the doctoral level. They understand where the money is coming from, what kinds of research you should do to get money. So that kind of contaminates the general environment. Back to Latvia. Eventually, our articles did get us an audience with government policymakers, such as I've referenced. So we were brought to see Prime Minister Kalvitis in the summer of 2006, and people in the Ministry of Finance. So yes, we got an audience. Were the results satisfactory? No. The last piece that I published in the popular press in Latvia in an attempt to sound the alarm was in June of 2008 in Vienna. And that article netted me a meeting with Guadmanis in October of 2008. And even as the crisis was unfolding, it was clear that they were willing to consider policy alternatives, maybe. But in this meeting that I had with Guadmanis, which was just one-on-one, I found him very well prepared. He'd actually done a lot of reading, a big stack of reports next to him. And it was clear that he'd read them. What I found somewhat unsettling was, I guess we all do this. Perhaps I shouldn't think of this as unsettling, but he kept defaulting to what he knew. So when I was talking about industrial policy, different tax policies, he brought out the usual arguments. Well, we can't go around picking winners. We can't do it. And of course, there's a history of development policies and industrial policies which have failed. But the assumption was straight from Juris Vixnings when he was younger. You don't pick winners. You don't get involved in industrial policy. You don't tax luxury items because that just takes capital away from the wealthy who would otherwise invest it in the real economy. Doesn't go into speculation in this interesting world and universe. So on the whole, the experience was instructive and unsatisfactory. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the second part of your question regarding resilience.
Resilience. How do countries protect themselves when things go wrong elsewhere? And is it important?
I need to think about it. So.
Does anybody else have some comments about either of those questions?
I sort of happened to write in Rubini's blog, Dr. Dooms. And I mean, he is great. I mean, he has forecast 27 out of the last 5 crises. So of course, he gets it right almost every time. But I sort of a little bit surprised that he earns his money from squeezing out free labor from people like me instead of going out there in the stock market. I have a
talk about free money. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What I do think, and I mean, if you come to Latvia, there is a troubling thing happening, which has happened in Latvia, which has not happened in Lithuania and Estonia, namely that the rankings for the political freedom has been lower the last 2 years. So the so-called Freedom House Index, which we normally love here in the region because it doesn't take into account the situation with the Russians, has lowered Latvia's rankings. And there are cases where people have written in the newspapers, go and change your lats to euros because there will be a devaluation. And then these guys have not got this kind of meetings, but they've got a meeting from the security police. And they put people up in prison for it. Yeah. And this is where things, according to my taste buds, get really, really ugly. This is a sort of, if I sort of can take the opportunities, because you sort of said the thing about resilience, this is one of the reasons, maybe I mean, I'm also unhappy about people who are unemployed and suffering and so on. And I would say some of the wage cuts in the Latvian public sector, this is much overdue. I mean, why should the Latvian central bank boss earn more than Bernanke? But keeping pluralism, we know from history that this is one of the challenges when you get these kind of economic shocks. You very easily get populism or what is worse. So we have a whole history of, I mean, why did the Nazis came to power in Germany? It was essentially a fiscal crisis. If you look at what is happening, also Russia, Putin there, right? It was a reflection on the default. Hungary has just passed some crazy media laws. And I think this is, for me, a sort of very big concern related to financial crisis. Hopefully the EU will tie in the craziest populist movements, but it's sad to see what's happening in Hungary, which has had a more sort of alternative economic model, and now they sort of, I'm worried. This again brings me to sort of, when you talk about resilience, then I would think that stability is a good thing. Partly because we don't like unemployment and so on, but also because of the feedback into the political system. And that makes me sort of a fiscal conservative. And I cannot find out whether it's which was my stomach or it was your comments about deficit spending which hurt the most right now. I'm sort of worried if there are probably all kind of things you can spend money on, all kind of good things. You were sort of having a little bit of troubles finding the things, but they're probably all kind of good things. We need some good roads to Riga and so on, so that Latvians can migrate out of the country. But on the other hand, now we have a boom in the economy. The economy grew 8% from first quarter 2010 to first quarter 2011. So this is crazy growth rates, which most people assess will slow down, but if they don't, then it's pretty wild. So to recommend deficit spending, starting building up liabilities in that situation would, at least for me, that sounds sort of getting the textbook upside down. Counter-cyclical fiscal policies would suggest that we are tightening now because our economy has started growing relatively fast again. One can tighten two different ways. One can tighten through cutting expenditures, that's one way. One can tighten through raising taxes, and that's another way. And I'm perhaps, sort of, at least as central banker, completely indifferent between the two options. But I'm not crazy about this idea that we should use the opportunity to borrow to get a debt of 20 or 30 or 40% of GDP. We simply know that for small periphery countries in Europe, these debt situations very easily blow up. I couldn't really see why would one take that risk. So if one wants to build a highway to Riga, then I would definitely recommend that one increases taxes.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can just continue the same. It wouldn't be more you're answering your question, but it would be going to the deficit spending, and I guess more to the question of the debate actually. No, I mean, of course it's the question. I mean, in Estonia, I think you have to sort of separate few issues. I mean, first is indeed the sustainability of the current growth rate. I mean, how the 8%, of course, you have to take into account. It comes from a very low paces and all that. And it's very much centered around few export activities. So it's energy, which might easily not continue. And it's centered around maybe 10 to 15 exporting companies, which are not actually giving you almost zero employment growth. I mean, none of these companies have actually hired anybody in the last 2 years. They've actually fired some of the people.